Good evening. I would like to welcome you to a Darwin Year event, and this one is sponsored by the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. My name is Shannon French, and I'm the brand new director of the Inamori Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with the center, our mission is to promote global ethical leadership. We celebrate the rich diversity of beliefs, both intellectual and spiritual, that we find all around the world, while at the same time encouraging reflection on those core human values that we all share. One of the primary purposes of the Inamori Center is to facilitate conversations about ethics. And in this year, in this Darwin year, we're focusing on ethics and human potential. So with that in mind, we have brought an outstanding speaker for you this evening to speak to you about Darwinian moral theory. And to introduce him, I would like to introduce my predecessor, Dr. Greg Eastwood, who will tell you about our speaker. Thank you.
Well, Robert Richards is the Morris Fishbein Professor of History of Science and Medicine and director of the center that bears the same name at the University of Chicago. He's written extensively on evolution, on religion and evolution, on Darwin, on behavior, on emotions, and many other topics. Among his books are these titles, and he's got a lot more books than I'm going to tell you. The Tragic Sense of Life, Ernest Haeckel, and the Struggle Over Evolutionary Thought. Another one, The Meaning of Evolution, the morphological construction and ideological reconstruction of Darwin's theory, Darwin and the emergence of evolutionary theories of mind and behavior, and then just simply Darwinian heresies. I wanted to also thank Professor Neil Greenspan, who's sitting up in the second row here, who has organized this Darwin year. I've sat in on most of his meetings, and I know how much work you've put into this, Neil, so thank you very much. So, okay, here's the question. Have morality, ethics, altruism, sympathy, fairness, cooperation, and things like that evolved in Darwinian fashion? Here's something I wrote several months ago on this subject in a local publication. Increasing evidence, beginning with speculations by Charles Darwin himself and accumulating since, indicating that yes, these high-minded qualities of human thought and behavior have evolved to the benefit of individuals and the community of humanity. Is doing good simply a matter of conscious, unconscious, or even genetic selfishness? Do we do good things to make us feel better or to be repaid in kind later? Are we engaged in some sort of Darwinian contest that pits our goodness genes against those of others? The answer has to be a qualified yes, but selfish goodness is not the whole story. To feel good about doing something good and attending to one's reputation, perhaps even with an eye that others would do good to us, are easily recognizable and usually acceptable human behaviors. Perhaps this is really a corollary of the golden rule. From an evolutionary perspective, evidence supports the notion that those who act within a set of moral principles, cooperate with others, and sometimes sacrifice for others are favored. It takes little imagination to understand why protecting our children, family, and others like us, and sacrificing ourselves for them, propagate our genes. But selfish goodness does not fully explain why people behave ethically or altruistically. How do we account for behaviors of kindness, fairness, and personal risk, even death, for complete strangers, people whom we will never see again? Is this something that is hardwired in there? Please welcome Professor Robert Richards, who will speak on Darwinian moral theory.
To have been invited by the Inamori Center and by its director, Shannon French, and recent director, Greg Eastwood, and with the help of Neil Greenspan. we are embarked on the Darwin year, where we are going to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the origin of species. It's certainly right that we do so, since the book Origin of Species is probably the most scientifically and culturally influential book in Western literature, comparable perhaps only to some of Aristotle's works in his own period and Newton in the early modern period. The academic and larger public is quite aware, I think, of what Darwin accomplished in the origin, but let me be pedantic about that. Professors are pedantic. And catalog those noticeable accomplishments, especially those with cultural import. Darwin demonstrated how biological phenomena, especially the creation of new species, could be explained without any appeal to supernatural causes. Prior to Darwin, there were some biologists familiar with the growing number of fossil remains, biologists who argued that species had been successively replaced in a progressive manner. They assumed this progressive advance of species enacted a divine plan, one that had a fixed goal or end, namely that fixed goal or end being the production of human beings as the final stage of that plan. But Darwin eliminated from biological science recourse to teleological conceptions, those barren virgins, as Francis Bacon and T.H. Huxley referred to them. As Stephen Jay Gould has argued, Darwin's theory was non-progressive. The logic of natural selection means that any adaptations made by species members to the environment can be quickly lost as the environment changes, which it constantly does in Darwin's view. So notions of progressive development in any universal sense have been eliminated in his theory. As Gould put it, using a slightly wacky metaphor, that if you replay the tape of life again, you'll get a different outcome. It's wacky because if you replay the same tape again, you're going to get the same outcome. Moreover, a progressivist view of the kind advanced by Herbert Spencer or Ernst Haeckel leads to the calibration of human groups as being higher or lower in respect to one another, and Darwin avoided that racist conception entirely. In the older dispensation, nature was viewed as a surrogate for the creator, and thus values were embedded in nature. Nature could be a standard for making judgments about good and evil. Darwin, however, eviscerated nature of value, so that, if anything, nature, under his conception, became completely indifferent to human aspirations. But actually, the warranted conclusion, perhaps, is even a little more unhappy. George Williams, the distinguished evolutionary biologist, commenting on the impact of Darwin's view, concluded, and here quoting Williams, "The inescapable arithmetic of predation and parasitism should be enough to show that nature is morally unacceptable." And someone like Michael Giesland, another prominent Darwinian thinker, put it even more starkly in his estimate of the moral consequences of natural selection. He said, "Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed." Well, this feature of the Darwinian accomplishment seems to give support to the creationist complaint that Darwinism instills a kind of morality of monkeys, that all biological creatures, including human beings, are driven only by selfish impulses, and that this is really the moral lesson of Darwinism. The creationist and intelligent designers maintain that it's not therefore surprising that Hitler and the Nazis endorsed Darwinian evolutionary theory and offered it as justification for their actions. This link with the Nazis, among other reasons, probably has led some political thinkers, Governor Sarah Palin, for example, to demand the teaching of creationism in the schools along with evolutionary theory. The importance of Darwin's Origin of Species, I think, is simply indisputable, especially as its function to establish the foundations of modern biology. However, the catalog of his presumed cultural accomplishments that I've just enumerated has, I think, from a historical point of view, one striking liability, namely that none of it's true, or at least that's what I want to argue in this presentation. I'll warn you ahead of time, mine is certainly not the orthodox view of the understanding of Darwin's accomplishment, but it is, I think, the warranted view, and that's what I hope to convince you of this afternoon. To foreground the trajectory of my argument, let me begin, as it were, at the end, namely with Darwin's own conclusion in The Origin of Species. In the last paragraph of the book, when he's explaining the consequences of natural selection, he writes, "Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows." Now, this sentence remains the same throughout the 6 editions of The Origin of Species, although the editions themselves changed rather dramatically from the first edition in 1859 to the later editions. And just these few phrases can be traced back to almost 20 years to essays that Darwin worked on in 1842 and 1844. And I think it's clear from the context that the word object here means purpose or end, as in final clause. Thus, the most exalted purpose or goal which we're capable of conceiving. And after all, what would be the most exalted object we would be capable of conceiving? Well, I think for Darwin, he says the production of the higher animals, but it's one species of higher animal in particular, namely us. And not simply us, but human beings as moral creatures. Darwin here is trying to, I think, justify the misery and death that results from natural selection. The goal, his theory indicates, is the production of the higher animals. That is, the misery and death that has preceded the advent of human beings, and even in the progressive development of proto-humans into humans with a well-developed civilization. That misery and death that natural selection operates on can be justified if the goal of the whole process is something as exalted as human nature with a moral streak in it. The goal of evolution, the aim of the teleological trajectory as Darwin originally conceived it, is thus, I think, man as a moral creature. And I'll try to show, in Darwin's conception, human beings are intrinsically moral, not moral accidentally, are moral as the result of having learned a number of commandments or precepts, but moral bred in the bone. Now, if this is the case, then I think one could quite reasonably ask, why hasn't this been recognized in previous Darwin scholarship? The orthodox understanding of Darwin's theory, that's the one I've just characterized, stems, I think, from a particular approach to Darwin's accomplishments that have been dominant in the last century, namely the approach of Neo-Darwinism. By Neo-Darwinism, I simply mean basically evolutionary theory as we understand it today. It's perhaps needless to say that Darwin was not a Neo-Darwinian. But I think there are at least 3 very good reasons why the Neo-Darwinian view has prevailed in the interpretation of Darwin and the Origin of Species. First, because of the continuity in development of evolutionary theory from Darwin's day through the mid-part of the 20th century during the construction of the evolutionary synthesis by such evolutionary biologists as Theodosius Dobzhansky, Sewell Wright, Ernst Mayr, Bernard Rensch, and others, right up to the present, so that there has been this kind of intellectual continuity that has moved from 1859 right to the present day. So it may simply be assumed that what Darwin wrought in 1859 is that same legacy that we enjoy today, and it's an easy thing to read back what we understand as evolutionary theory today into that earlier period. Another reason for the prevalence of the Neo-Darwinian interpretation is because some of the major interpreters of Darwin's work are themselves contributors to contemporary evolutionary theory. Such scholars as the late Stephen Jay Gould, Michael Giesland, Richard Lewontin, Ernst Mayr, and many others. A final reason for the Neo-Darwinian interpretation of Darwin's accomplishments and the success thereof stems, I think, from an epistemological view of scientific theories. This view holds that scientific theories are abstract entities that might be realized at different times and in different periods, much in the way, for example, that you might conceive, say, Bach's Goldberg variations as having been constructed by Bach really as a system of abstract relationships among sounds, and that they could be realized in the 18th century by Johann Gottlieb Goldberg playing a harpsichord, or in the mid-20th century by Glenn Gould playing a modern piano. So that it's the same Goldberg variations, the assumption is, but just differently expressed in these two different periods. So if scientific theories are like that, then one could have this one, as it were, abstract entity, which was exemplified in 1859 by Darwin's own writing, and in the present day by many other evolutionary biologists. Darwin's language may have been rather more Victorian and decorous than contemporary language, but the theory is the same. At least that's the presumption. And so it's easy enough to assume that the way we think about evolutionary theory today is pretty much, in its essence, the way Darwin thought about it. So another reason for the Neo-Darwinian interpretation of Darwin's book. However, if you conceive of scientific theories as themselves historical entities, then Darwin's theory is just that conception found in his book in 1859, The Origin of Species. It had a preliminary development in his notebooks and in essays that he constructed leading up to the origin. It was modified gently in the subsequent editions of The Origin. Under the hands of his subsequent disciples and those who inherited the basic ideas, those ideas may have been changed even further. And insofar as the subsequent development of Darwin's basic theory had changed rather significantly, then it has, as it were, speciated. It's become a different kind of thing. So that's the argument that I'd like to propose to you today, that one of the reasons why it's a mistake to read back Neo-Darwinism into Darwin is because the theory indeed has changed over time. Now, in order to provide the context for my argument, let me just briefly sketch the history of Darwin's development. This is something I think that during the Darwin year you're going to get ad nauseam, but let me be the first to induce that queasy feeling. So we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth next year. He was born February 12th of 1809. He was the son of Robert Waring Darwin, a very successful Shrewsbury physician, and the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, who himself had developed a theory of the transmutation of species over time, even before his French counterpart, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, had proposed such a theory. Charles Darwin was familiar certainly with the work of his grandfather, and he was familiar with the work of Lamarck prior to his coming to the view that species have changed over time. The young Darwin followed his elder brother, his father, and his grandfather to Edinburgh Medical School at age 16. Not an unusual age for one to begin medical school. Darwin, however, had a miserable time in Edinburgh. If you read his autobiography, really quite a charming work, he recalls the experience of going to lectures at 8 o'clock on a winter's morning in Edinburgh. He thought it was both boring and dreadful, and he could not stomach it. He lasted 2 years at Edinburgh Medical School, and he came down, disappointing his father. And Darwin was always, in a certain way, wanting to please his father in a variety of ways, but this is certainly one in which he displeased him. Although Darwin said that the notion of studying very hard simply evaporated because he figured out that his father would leave him with a legacy that would allow him to live comfortably thereafter, and so that he really didn't have to work too hard. When Darwin muses about this in his autobiography, he says, you know, I really, however, never imagined I would be so rich a man as I am. He had, at the very beginning of the railroad boom, invested in railroad stocks, and he became quite wealthy as a result. His father decided that one of the avenues for an unpromising son of the English gentry would be the ministry. So Darwin did dutifully go to Cambridge with the idea of becoming a country parson. He didn't break his head studying there either. He graduated with the equivalent of a gentleman's C. In order to indicate how he spent most of his time, he tells another one of these marvelous stories in his autobiography. He spent most of his time, he said, in dinner parties and fox hunting, but the passion that occupied him for the most part was collecting beetles. He was a bug collector. He tells the story of one early evening when he was out in the field behind his college. He was searching for beetles. He found a beautiful one. He picked it up and admired it. All of a sudden, he saw another one that he had to have, and that was in his left hand. And then as he started going home, he kicked over a rock, and he saw yet a third one, which was even better than the other two. He was perplexed about what to do, so he took the one in his right hand and popped it in his mouth to pick up the other one. But as he said, the one in his mouth exuded an acrid fluid, and he had to spit it out, and he lost the other two as well. Darwin was struck by beetles, and in fact, it's a passion that he carried right through almost to the end of his day, although at the end of his day, it was earthworms that really fascinated him. When he was at Cambridge, he said he didn't doubt the literal truth of the Bible, though, as he later remarked in his autobiography, quoting him, "It never struck me how illogical it was to say that I believed in what I could not understand and what is in fact unintelligible." Well, Darwin had no real enthusiasm for pursuing the ministry, and after graduation, he leapt at the opportunity to sail away from boring England on a great adventure to South America on HMS Beagle. He was to act as companion to the ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy was 26 years old as the captain of the ship, and Darwin 22. The idea was the ship would sail to South America and perhaps beyond, charting the waters for English merchant ships. He was also, during this trip, to make geological surveys and to collect specimens of plants and animals that were discovered along the way. And he certainly did that in South America and then in Australia and in many of the islands of the Atlantic and Pacific. The journey would last almost 5 years, from late December 1831 to October 1836, and make a circuit around the world in that time. While on the Beagle, Darwin studied the books of two authors in particular. Sir Charles Lyell, whose Principles of Geology was just being published as Darwin embarked on his trip, and he took the first volume with him. There were 3 volumes altogether. He got the other 2 from merchant ships along the way. And so Lyell's book was extraordinarily important for Darwin, as was the works of the German Romantic scientist Alexander von Humboldt, who himself had made a 5-year voyage to South and Central America some 30 years before Darwin. Lyell led him to see that the geological formations that he observed were often much older than conventional notions about a young Earth. For example, when he reached the Galapagos Islands, Darwin could see that they were volcanic in origin, and as you can see, that seems to be perfectly obvious. He judged them to be roughly 1 million years old, and our own contemporary estimates are about not far off from that, about 1.5 million years old. Humboldt, Darwin's other inspiration, was a scientist and friend of the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Humboldt led Darwin to appreciate the aesthetic character of the natural world. And indeed, Humboldt's own book, Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of the New Continent, was a book originally published in French, It was then translated into English, and Darwin, when he was at Cambridge, got a hold of the first 2 volumes of the personal narrative. It describes Humboldt's trip to South and Central America. It simply inspired Darwin, and he, as a result of reading the book, he had the hope and desire himself to sail away to some exotic place, perhaps the Canary Islands, because Humboldt had so evocatively described them. As a romantic, Humboldt had shed any belief in a personal God and regarded nature herself to be virtually divine. And Darwin seems to have imbibed precisely this attitude, as this concluding passage from his Beagle Diary suggests. He writes, "Among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none exceeds in sublimity the primeval forest, undefaced by the hand of man, whether those of Brazil, where the powers of life are predominant, or those of Tierra del Fuego, where death and decay prevail. Both are temples filled with the varied productions of the God of nature. No one can stand unmoved in these solitudes without feeling there is more in man than the breath of his body." In the jungles of South America and in the forbidding coast around Cape Horn, Darwin found the God of nature, not, it should be underlined, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. While on the voyage, Darwin seems to have remained fairly orthodox in his biology. Although he dug up the remains of some extinct creatures, for example, the Megatherium. This is an animal about the size of a rhinoceros. It is the progenitor, ultimately, of the modern sloth, and Darwin had found many fragments of that animal, and he sent them back to England for cataloging and display. He was intrigued by the animals of the Galapagos, but even they seem not to have jarred him in any particular way to alter his view that species were stable. It's only when he returned home and began sorting his specimens, especially his mockingbirds, which he got on the Galapagos, that he seriously entertained the thesis that species had changed over time. Darwin collected 3 different kinds of mockingbirds while on the Galapagos. And these birds differed morphologically from one another, but Darwin had assumed that these were just varieties of the same species. And he had a good theory about how those mockingbirds, as well as all the other animals on the Galapagos, had gotten there. These were volcanic islands. They came into existence, as he thought, about 1 million years ago. And he assumed that animals from the mainland, Ecuador is about 600 miles away, had either gotten blown over, had floated over on grass mats or whatever, and that the island became populated with animals as a result of this. So that he had a theory about how the mockingbirds got from the mainland, and they were similar to mainland mockingbirds, and got over to the Galapagos. He also had a view how they may have changed slightly due to the impact of the environment. And at this period, it would be perfectly reasonable for an orthodox biologist to maintain that within the parameters of a species, alterations could occur to create, say, new varieties of a species, but that the species boundaries certainly would not be abridged. When Darwin brought the mockingbirds back with him on his travels, and he was cataloging those and many of his other specimens, he had long conversations with John Gould, who was an ornithologist at the British Museum, perhaps the world's leading authority on birds. And Gould said, these are good species. These aren't varieties. These are different species. This seems to have tripped a mind ready to think in these terms. And so roughly in March of 1837, so he comes back at the end of 1836, he's working with many different anatomists, ornithologists, botanists at the British Museum, cataloging everything that he has brought back and sent back. And in March, because of his conversations with Gould, he starts entertaining the hypothesis that species have altered over time. It was not, as it were, a radical hypothesis in the sense that Lamarck had suggested the same thing. His own grandfather had maintained the same thing. So he starts keeping notebooks on this hypothesis. And what he's worried about mostly is how to explain it. What causes the transmutation of species over time? And it was only in September of 1838 when, as he said, he read Thomas Malthus for recreation, Malthus's essay on population, which led him to construct his theory of natural selection. That theory, from our perspective, simply says that many more creatures are born than can be sustained by the local environment. And of those creatures, some will be at a competitive advantage by reason of chance traits that they manifest. Creatures with those properties will have a better opportunity of reaching reproductive age and passing those traits on to progeny, and so the species will gradually change over time. So, for example, some eons ago, a fish living in a shallow swamp, by chance, may have had those traits that allowed it to creep a bit on land to, say, perhaps seek other kinds of prey or themselves escape predators. And that would be natural selection. And from generation to generation to generation, such fish would be developed with each generation slightly in the direction that seemed most advantageous, namely to utilize the resources of the land. Tiktaalik Rosea is a fossil specimen that my colleague at the University of Chicago, Neil Shubin, discovered about 4 years ago in Canada. It is a fish, but in the examination of the fins, you already see the beginning of wrist bones and arm bones to be on the way to being a tetrapod. It also has a head on a neck such that the head can turn, which no modern fish has. Well, on the other hand, some animals have gone back to the sea. This is a Darwin, a mammal, and as you can see from the fossil remains, on the one hand, it has all the characteristics of a mammal. It's a tetrapod. It has 4 limbs. But the hind limbs, which would be useless in the sea, have been greatly reduced and are on their way to being excluded from this animal. So this is a progenitor of modern whales. And even in contemporary whales, you can sometimes find along the backbone a very miniaturized pelvic girdle, perfectly useless, but just a retained structure from a much earlier period when these animals were actually land animals. Well, what is natural selection such that it can create such wonders? Darwin didn't originally formulate the principle of natural selection with the logical smoothness that would grace his later expressions of the principle. He initially explored the idea of natural selection using a metaphor that sunk quite deeply into the language that he used in The Origin of Species and in his notebooks and essays. When he was trying to express to himself what natural selection is, he wrote out 2 essays, one in 1842 and one in an expansion of that in 1844. And when he's trying to understand for himself what natural selection is all about, he formulates a model by which he is going to understand it. And here's what he says. Let us now suppose a being with penetration sufficient to perceive the differences in the outer and inner organization quite imperceptible to man, and with forethought extending over future centuries to watch with unerring care and select for any object the offspring of an organism produced under the foregoing circumstances. I can see no conceivable reason why he could not form a new race or several were he to separate the stock of the original organisms and work on several islands adapted to new ends. As we assume his discrimination and his forethought and his steadiness of object to be incomparably greater than those qualities in man, so we may suppose the beauty and complication of the adaptations of the new race and their differences from the original stock to be greater than in the domestic races produced by man's agency. The model Darwin has chosen as a way to understand and explicate the idea of natural selection is that of a all-powerful, intelligent being, one that had forethought and could select animals to produce beautiful and intricate structures. This prescient being made choices, as he says elsewhere in his essay, that were infinitely wise compared to those of man. As a wise breeder, this being would prevent back crosses of his flock. Nature, as the analog of this being, was thus conceived, not as a machine, but as an intelligent force. Perhaps no phrase comes more trippingly to an evolutionary biologist's lips today as the mechanism of natural selection. But if you search out Darwin's work, The Origin of Species, the word mechanism or machinery or any variation thereof appears only once. His model of natural selection is not that of a mechanical contrivance, but, as the model suggests, an intelligent being. And this is a model, as we can talk about perhaps in the question period, that actually does work in his theory and alters that theory such that a contemporary biologist would find it a bit strange. In The Origin of Species, this being is now a bit more reserved, nonetheless appears in the chapter explaining the characteristics of natural selection. Initially, Darwin succinctly expressed the principle that when he's working it out, this is what he says in The Origin, and you will see that the language that he employs in 1859 is much like that language that he employed in 1844. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. Man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances, except insofar as they may be useful to any being. She can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends. Darwin adds to this characterization of nature as a wise, omniscient, and altruistic being. He says, can we wonder then that nature's productions should be far truer in character than man's productions, that they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex conditions of life, and should plainly bear the stamp of a far higher workmanship? These cadences are virtually biblical in which Darwin describes natural selection. These are terms that were previously reserved for the deity. His natural selection operates much like the previously departed deity. It acts with intelligence and compassion. And what's the end? What purpose does it have? What end or goal does it have? From our perspective, to ask what the end or goal of evolution might be, or the goal of nature, seems to be just completely beyond the pale of what a contemporary biologist would think even appropriate to query. But Darwin does think of the process of natural selection in The Origin in these quasi-intentional fashions. He offers the great peroration at the end of The Origin that I already quoted to you. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object in purpose, our purpose, we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. Thus, Darwin depicts the purpose of evolution as the production of an exalted object, namely ourselves as moral creatures. Now, what I'm trying to argue is that Darwin's language and the metaphors that he employs in his essays and eventuating in his Origin of Species have a deep structure to them that gives a shape to the theory that he presents in The Origin, a shape that is quite different than what we usually think about as Darwin's theory. But insofar as you believe that Darwin's theory is that theory found in the book, The Origin of Species, then one has to take these seriously. They're not mere rhetoric. And as I mentioned before, they actually do work. They give shape to the different features of the theory. A month after Darwin had read Malthus, which gave him a preliminary formulation for his notion of natural selection, Darwin wrote this in his notebook. My theory gives great final cause. Do not wish to say only cause, but one great final cause of sexes. For otherwise there would be as many species as individuals, and few only social, hence not social instincts, which, as I hope to show, is probably the foundation of all that is most beautiful in the moral sentiments of the animate beings. Now, This needs just a bit of explication. Darwin was quite well aware that reproduction of biological organisms has two rather distinct, there are distinct processes in reproduction. One is asexual reproduction. It might be the way what we think of as bacteria just splitting off, or a good many invertebrate organisms, sea organisms, also either bud off or reproduce asexually. And sometimes they'll alternate between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And then there, of course, is sexual reproduction. And Darwin thought that there were great advantages in sexual reproduction. But one of them, it produced a kind of stability in the species at the same time as providing variability upon which natural selection could work. But what he is suggesting here is that you need sexual reproduction in order to have social creatures. And in order to have moral creatures, you first need social creatures. So that the final cause, that is, the reason that you have sexual reproduction, is because of this consequence, namely the production of moral creatures. So that the account that Darwin is at least thinking in these terms, the account of why there is sexuality or sexual reproduction, is in order to produce moral creatures, namely ultimately us. Shortly after he penned the passage up on the screen, he turned in another notebook to working out a theory of morality. Because if you think that what one has to explain is the evolution of morality, and Darwin certainly thought that's what you had to explain. Darwin was a British empiricist, and he was brought up in that tradition. And if you're a good British empiricist, the distinction between human beings and animals is not cut along the dimensions of reason, human beings being rational creatures and animals not. Most British empiricists would have assumed that animals had some spark of reason, could reason like human beings could reason, perhaps not as articulately or as with the same amount of complexity, but nonetheless could be, as we understand it, rational creatures, all the way down to the honeybee. Many natural theologians had no problem in talking about the rational character of honeybees. After all, they construct these magnificent cells in hexagonal fashion. They must have some modicum of geometry about them. So reason is not the Rubicon which one has to cross in order to get human beings. But no British empiricist, and certainly that was a challenge to Darwin, believed that animals were moral creatures. Human beings are distinctively moral creatures. Therefore, if you're going to give an account of the origin of human beings out of animal ancestors, you're going to have to show how one could go from certain kinds of antecedents in animals to reach human moral conscience. And this is something that Darwin, though he works out a theory in his notebooks, it's an incomplete theory, and I'll just mention why it's an incomplete theory. It gets its full development in The Descent of Man in 1871, so the origin's 1859, Descent of Man is some years later. In The Origin of Species, one of the animals conspicuously absent, as I think many of you know, is human beings. The Origin of Species really doesn't refer or give an account of human beings except in one distinct reference, but it leaves it to the reader's imagination, and the first reviewers of Darwin's book certainly had that kind of imagination. They saw what the implications were for human beings, and that's where the onus of and the viability of the theory was challenged on could it give an account of human beings. One of the problems that Darwin was working on when he was constructing The Origin of Species, in a very serendipitous way, led to the development of his moral theory. The problem that he met, which he says in his notebooks threatened to overturn his whole theory, was how to explain the anatomy, structure, and instincts of social insects, bees and ants in particular. In bees, if you look at a beehive, there are different castes of bees. There are soldier bees, there are worker bees, there's the queen. In ants, it's much the same. And say the soldiers, either soldier ants or bees, have distinctive instincts and traits. How can you give them an explanation? One of the difficulties in explaining such traits, I mean, if you want to give a natural selection account of them, it seems impossible, because how does natural selection work? It operates on any organism that has traits that give it an advantage such that it will reach reproductive age and pass on those traits to its progeny. But worker ants and bees are sterile. They have no progeny. They are neuters. So natural selection doesn't seem to be applicable to give an account of the traits of those animals. This puzzled Darwin for a very long time, and it was only on the eve of the writing out of The Origin of Species that he came to the solution that we now appreciate, namely that natural selection works on the whole hive or community, so that those nests, for example, of bees that by chance have some of the members being more aggressive, and when any intruder breaks in to try to steal the honey of the hive, that they would attack the intruder. Those nests that had by chance some of those creatures would have a better chance of survival than those that didn't. And those nests would go on to propagate themselves, founding new colonies, and that trait of aggressive attack and then therefore different anatomical structures would evolve over time. You could perhaps see how this might be the foundation for Darwin's own analysis of human morality, and indeed it is. Soldier bees, as it were, act altruistically for the hive. They sacrifice themselves for the good of the community. That's ultimately the essence of altruism, to act for the good of another at cost to self. And what Darwin then saw this as the model for what happens in human groups. In The Descent of Man, he says, you can imagine that proto-human groups, we lived initially in small clans, and that those clans that by chance had members that acted in a cooperative fashion, in a fashion to ward off intruders, even at the cost of their own lives, those that were faithful to members of the group, that those clans would have a better chance of surviving than those who lacked such members, and that they would go out to propagate their kind, form new clans, and this would be the origin of the altruistic impulse in human beings. And for Darwin, the altruistic impulse is at the foundation of the ethical response. And so in The Descent of Man, he develops this a little further, but that's essentially the theory that he develops. And it's a theory which means that morality for human beings is not something adventitious, not something you have to learn. It is something that makes you to be the kind of thing you are. It is, as I said before, bred in the bone. Well, Darwin conceived natural selection to be a wise selector, producing continued improvement in the animal stock, as he observed in the last chapter of his book. As natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection. But it was a perfection to be achieved only at the cost of suffering and death. And yet, I think this signals the deep embeddedness of Darwin's teleological framework. Suffering and death had a purpose, had a goal. It was a final cause that arose like a shadow of his earlier Christian convictions, modest though those convictions were. He carried over the idea that out of death came life more abundantly. This was a sentiment enforced by his reading of Milton's Paradise Lost. When Darwin was on the Beagle voyage, one of the books that he always had with him, he would stick it in his saddlebags, and as he would ride his burro or his horse into the interior, he would at odd moments take out Paradise Lost and memorize long passages from it. In one of the sections of Paradise Lost, you have this passage. It's Satan is approaching the Garden of Eden, and he is momentarily stopped by an entangled bank. And Milton writes, "Now to the ascent of that steep savage hill, Satan had journeyed on, pensive and slow, but further way found none, so thick entwined as one continued brake, this undergrowth of shrubs and tangled bushes had perplexed all path of man or beasts that passed that way. Thence up he flew, and on the tree of life, the middle tree and highest there that grew, sat like a cormorant, yet not true life, thereby regained, but sat devising death to them who lived, not on the virtue thought of that life-giving plant, but only used for prospect, what, well used, had been the pledge of immortality." However, with the fall, as Newton hints in Paradise Lost, and then certainly expands in Paradise Regained, with the fall came the possibility of greater life, namely the coming of the Savior. That's, I think, the message of the Origin of Species. At the end of the chapter of the Origin, Darwin imagines an entangled bank, as he says, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth. And he says, to reflect on these very different forms, that they've been produced by laws acting on them, the chief of which is natural selection or the struggle for life. How can that occur? What it means is that the suffering and death that has been produced will nonetheless bring forth these forms and many more. So the end of the text is also the end of my talk. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Darwin was no Neo-Darwinian. Thank you.
I think we have some time for some Q&A, so please. Wow, we have a first speaker.
Well, we have a microphone, not a question.
So if you raise your hand, the mic will come to you.
So I take it that silence means consent, that you are perfectly convinced of this. So you've got, Greg is going to be the first challenger. There's somebody in the back too.
The students of this university were brainwashed a few weeks ago when they read David Quammen's Reluctant Mr. Darwin, which my reading held to the traditional view that you first talked about.
Yeah.
That Darwin ended his life a complete atheist, and that he was not a teleologic thinker, as I think you implied
that I'm
he was.
arguing that he in fact was. Yeah.
Yes. So what is your view of that? At the end of his life, was he thinking the way you portrayed him? Was he, did he believe in some sort of a divine spirit?
Well, I think what I'm trying to suggest is that Darwin replaced his conventional religious views with a different conception, namely that of natural selection. There's somebody in the back who's waving his hand, which he looks fairly aggressive, so why don't you stay down here? Darwin is replacing what was a conventional religious perspective and belief in a deity with another structure which had many of the same features. So that in that way there was a kind of shift, a fairly comfortable shift for Darwin to move in that direction. So Darwin himself says, I think if you just trace his own religious trajectory, while he's writing The Origin, he's probably moved to the position of being a deist, so that what he maintains is, yes, God exists, and God has created laws, and these laws operate in the natural world to explain the biological phenomena, that is, natural selection and its operations, variation, but God doesn't intervene seriatim by fiat to arrange things and create creatures specially. So he's abandoned that sort of immediate intervention of the deity, but he still has God as a formulator of laws that operate in nature. Now, sometime 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, he's quizzed about his religious views, and by that time he says, my religious views are such that the term that best captures them is that formed by my recent formation by my friend T.H. Huxley, namely agnosticism, that he felt he was agnostic. So I think that's the argument. Just one example of, though, the power of this, which I think is the power of the language that you find embedded in the origin. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a friend of Herbert Spencer's, Wallace wrote his friend Darwin and said, you talk about natural selection as if it were an entity making these choices and had intentionality. I think you ought to use the term that Spencer has developed, namely survival of the fittest, because that really does capture what you mean. And that would depersonalize the metaphors that you're using and evacuate them of all power initially. And Darwin says, well, I think I'll keep natural selection. So in the 5th and 6th editions, you find him saying, giving the descriptions of natural selection that I mentioned, and he says this is natural selection, or as some would call it, survival of the fittest. So he does add survival of the fittest. But he realizes, he said, natural selection performed a function for him. And I think, although he was not always quite so reflective about what precisely the function is, it actually worked in the book in ways that I think can be described and delineated. So this is simply to say that, yes, your students have been brainwashed into the Neo-Darwinian interpretation of Darwin's views. There was a question, though, in the back.
Well, I think the thing that you probably have going for you, which works really well, is that we can't prove if a worker ant has free will or not. So in that sense, we can assume that maybe other beings have a sense of morality. I guess the thing that I'm failing to understand is that natural selection seems to have shown that populations that exhibit certain social organizations, something like cooperation, helps populations that can use these things to help them get a hold of a finite number of resources.
Yeah.
But the thing that I'm having trouble understanding is how morality has ever been shown to kind of benefit any population's chance of selection. There's nothing here that can be proven because, again, without knowing if any other organisms are capable of free will except for maybe our own, and knowing that we haven't had the chance to go through that selection process yet and see what comes out of it, I don't find any proof for this theory that morality has anything to do with natural selection.
Well, if you think that we are natural creatures and you want to give an account of those distinctive traits of human beings, from a Darwinian perspective, what you have available are the resources that Darwin has provided you with to give that account. I think from his perspective, it's not a question of whether lower creatures have free will or not. He didn't think human beings had free will. So that free will is, from his perspective, just a non-starter. Although he has an interesting sort of twist on it. He thinks that insofar as you believe you are determined to act in certain ways, it as it were, reinforces your duties and the duties you have as a parent to your offspring and so on. It's not perhaps a view that we would buy, but being a good empiricist, he thought that the notion of free will was a metaphysical conceit, and he didn't need it. So that animals act altruistically, not through any kind of reflection. We don't think little ants consider what they're doing. They just do it, and they're built to do it in a certain way. Just as he thinks we are built to act morally, virtually without reflection. I mean, one of the aspects of Darwin's notion about how the instinct for altruism operates in us is if you see a drowning child, you don't stop to think, well, let's see, should I try to save it? Should I call the police. I don't want to get my socks wet. You don't do that. You jump in, you pull the kid out. That kind of impulsive action, at least from Darwin's perspective, is what we mean by morality. If you think about it, if you see a kid in trouble, say out in the river here or Lake Erie, you just jump in impulsively, pull the kid out, people will think you're a moral hero. If you stand on the beach and say, well, let me think about this. I have certain other obligations. Kid might survive if I pull him out, maybe he won't. If you did that kind of calculation, we would think you the most stone-hearted individual possible. So that kind of action is almost second nature in a moral fashion is what we prize. And Darwin has, in fact, given an account of it, I think.
Then my question is, then what is that drive to? This whole idea of natural selection means that there's something coming after this.
Well, but I think you just said it yourself a little earlier, namely those societies that have cooperators who help one another in times of need. That's the very glue of any society. And especially small groups, when we're thinking about proto-human beings living in rather difficult circumstances, those kinds of cooperative actions are absolutely necessary for the survival of that group. So what cooperation means, what mutual help means, mutual aid, is that group is going to live to propagate their kind, whereas the people who have those groups that have only selfish individuals who are at one another's throats or always trying to get their own advantage, they will have a less good chance of survival. So that's what Darwin has in mind.
In your readings from Darwin, would you say that he ever suggests that he thinks that bees and ants and such are higher animals because then they have, they may not have the rationality, the articulated rationality that we do, but would he think, based on the altruism that they supposedly have, then they're higher animals?
Well, he certainly thinks that sociality is a higher level of organization, whether you find it in ants and bees or you find it in antelope, who are social creatures, or prides of lions, or the great apes, or so forth. That kind of sociality, he thinks, is really a progressive development, and the group that exhibits it in the most exquisite form is, in fact, us. So sociality is a kind of higher organizational structure, as Darwin sees it. And altruism is implicit. It is because the group can only function if the group members act in a cooperative fashion with one another. Otherwise, it's just a number of isolated individuals acting for their own benefit. So
one more question, Neil. Your central quote in your thesis is that one where you have the word object, which you conveniently then interpret as purpose. I don't see
shrewdly and textually and reasonably, yes.
But not definitively. And it seems to me that you're assuming what you aim to prove by sticking purpose in that quote the way you do. And if you look at the full context of On the Origin of Species, it's not clear to me that he really believes in this teleological idea that you're putting forward, because his entire mechanism, which he was reluctant to make public, in fact suggests the opposite. And again, why then would his contemporaries have been so offended as they were if it was this more gentle shift than the more radical one that it really fits better with the standard interpretation of his intentions?
Well, of course, not all of his contemporaries were so taken aback by it. Asa Gray, a Protestant minister at Harvard who was a botanist, he was much taken by it, and there were many others who came to terms with it. One of the...
Yeah, but I'm talking about the bulk of the religious community in England.
The bulk of the religious community, I think, initially opposed the Darwinian idea. I think that's perfectly true. But of course, what has happened is that insofar as they believed, either not quite so literally in Genesis, or at least believed that God had created human beings out of the dust of the earth, this was a radical, heretical departure from that kind of attitude, that we weren't created out of the dust of the earth. We were created out of antecedents that were pretty much like us and all the way back. So I think that is enough of a stumbling block to prevent an easy transition. The word object is, you're right, what is the most exalted object we can think of? Well, there's different ways of understanding that word, but in the context of his use of things like final cause in his notebooks, embedded in which is the word object, it seems to me that that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation, and it's an overall structural interpretation. So when one looks at many of the passages in which Darwin talks about the progressive development of human beings and mental and structural characteristics, he is a progressivist. I think that's, it's one of the things that Steve Gould, before he died, came to terms with, that Darwin was indeed a progressivist. He tried to diminish the impact of that alteration. But it's from all of these features that the argument is built. And as I said, it really does work in the Origin of Species. That is, it makes the origin look different than it otherwise might have. Just to give you one small example. If you look at the origin, Darwin, when he's talking about variation, he says favorable variations might occur a couple every 10,000 years. Now, wait a minute, what's a couple every 10,000 years? The origin is like a geological deposit in which ideas that he formulated very early are also to be found, as well as ideas that he formulated later. But you'll find several instances in which he talks about favorable variations occurring very infrequently. What he's thinking about, of course, is the Lyellian geological source of variation. That is, the environment changes very slowly geologically, but it has ultimate impact on living organisms, but then they're going to change very slowly or exhibit variations. So that what you needed was a selector that was infinitely wise, could capture these minute variations and retain them in some fashion. So, but that's nothing a machine could do, at least in his notion of a machine or anyone at the time. So, I mean, that's just another example of the way in which I think the idea of an intellectual force is really operative for Darwin. I mean, it's obviously something that we would not cotton to today, and we certainly don't.
I think we should probably let those people who need to go home and take care of other business do that. And if we have additional questions, like I saw one over here, okay. Professor Richards will be here for a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.